much for being here, and thank you very much to our speaker, Clare. Said I shouldn't say anything about her work, but I think I should say at least that she's one of the authors of Metaphysical Animals, which is part of the reason why this was sort of more or less turned into a secret Mary Midgley symposium. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you so much to organisers. It's just been the most wonderful conference. So I'm going to Sophia, Leah, Leia, and Julia. Yeah. So thank you. It's just been really wonderful. Loads of fantastic conversations and connections, and things are already happening on the back of the conference. So I'm kind of sorry to do this, but I've got a long talk which I'm going to read, because otherwise I can't keep control of this material. But hopefully it'll be okay, and it won't drop off. And if you do drop off a very certain bit, I think you can come back in at some point, because there are bits of Midgley that will grab your attention because she's such an amazing writer. Okay, so in her 1983 book, Animals and Why They Matter, Mary Midgley notes a feature of our species which for her amounts to both a calour and a grace. Humans live with a great variety of other animals. We live, she says, in a mixed community. At the same time, she raises a challenge. Perhaps we should take this peculiar human talent more seriously and try to understand its workings. So that's what I want to do in this talk. I'll explain why familiar forms of neo-Aristotelian ethical naturalism could only take us so far, and I outline the respects in which a Midgleyean metaphysics can take us a bit further. Okay. And hello to anyone who's listening to this. Okay, I'm going to start with 3 images. It's like a frame. So the first is a photograph of Charles Darwin's study at his home down house, where he lived for 40 years. It was taken by his son Leonard, probably around the time of his father's death in 1842. So I want you to notice the slips of paper pinned to the wall above Darwin's desk, to the right of the fireplace. In Beast and Man, her important first book, published in 1978, Midgley commends Darwin. Rightly did Darwin pin up paper warning himself to be careful about using words such as higher and lower. So Down House became a school for girls in 1907. Mary Midgley then strutting with a pupil. I don't know whether she ever accepted Darwin's post-it notes. Okay. Second, this is another piece of paper. It's a fragment of Midgley's de-film thesis on Plotinus, entitled Plotinus and Individuation, which she began in 1947, and which is currently being prepared for publication by Plotinus scholar Panayota Vasilopoulos. Vasilopoulos notes Midgley's apparent but unattributed endorsement of Inge's 1918 characterization of Plotinus's conception of the soul as the wanderer of the metaphysical world. So the final image is of one such wanderer. The first pictures of Earth from space filled TV screens in 1969, but Midgley has said that her Neil Armstrong was Jane Goodall. I used to think that the analogy meant to signal the respect in which the ecologist's work to our self-understanding was more transformative than a moon landing. But I now see something further. Armstrong could see the whole of the planet from without, and perhaps this is the cosmic perspective that Mara was trying to induce us into with that lovely led meditation. But Goodall was encountering part of the whole of life from within. So this is a kind of an oblique thought that I hope will come into focus later. So these 3 images place Midgley, I am thinking, in a broad sweep of time and suggest a tiny snapshot of some influences. Midgley did not finish her de-film thesis on Plotinus. Instead, she got married, moved to Newcastle, had 3 children, including David, who's here in the front row, lovely. And as she put it, generally put her feet up. So in Midgley's case, this involved writing book reviews for the New Statesman, as well as numerous philosophical articles, many of them deep and prescient, together with repeated raids, this is her term, on the libraries of Newcastle, so as to acquaint herself with ecology and its burgeoning development in the field of ecology. Beast and Man was the fruit of those raids. Famously, it begins, we are not just rather like animals, we are animals, and I will return to this. Okay, so now you can lift your hand out. My title is Midgleyean Metaphysics for Mixed Communities. The notion of the mixed community, there's nothing happening on the slide now for quite a long time. Okay. But you can just focus on this wonderful font. Okay, so the notion of the mixed community appears in the 10th chapter of Natalie's third book, Animals and Why They Matter, published in 1983. So in it, she makes a number of striking claims, and these are A on your handout. So 1, human communities involve animals. 2, through domestication, though domestication involved exploitation, it could not have occurred without personal or emotional involvement between tamers and tamed. 3, belief in animal sentience is essential to successful exploitation. 4, animals became tame not just through the fear of violence, but because they were able to form individual bonds with those who tame them by coming to understand the social signals addressed to them. 5, all creatures which have been successfully domesticated are ones which were originally social. 6, those who succeed in training animals do so by interacting socially with them, by attending to them and coming to understand how various things appear from each animal's point of view. Note each here. She says there is something which it is like to be a horse or a donkey, and there's something to what it's like to be this horse or donkey. 7, real individual affection can arise between animals and people. 8, humans have a capacity, if limited, to attend to and understand the moods and reactions of other species. So, we have here an array of descriptive, empirical, philosophical, historical, sociological, and what have been called natural historical claims. For instance, 2 and 4, and to some extent 5, combine in current work by my biosciences colleague Sean Twiss. He and his team hypothesized that subordinate individuals in wolf packs have the capacity to express a wider range of emotion so that they can pacify and engage with more dominant pack members. The working idea is that such flexible expression in subordinate individuals in wolves, the ancestors of which are the same as those of the domestic dog, provided the gateway for bonding with humans, which ultimately led to domestication. Okay, 3 runs counter to certain forms of behaviorism, and this is the role that it dialectically plays in the chapter. 6 is likely grounded in first personal testimony and experience, and likewise 7. In her chapter, Midgley reflects on an Old Testament example from the prophet Nathan, lest, in her words, we are inclined to denounce pet owning as gratuitous perversion produced by modern agriculture. So here's Nathan. The poor man had nothing save one little ewe lamb, which he had brought and nourished up, and it grew up together with him and with his children. It did eat of his own morsel, and drank of his own cup, and lay in his bosom, and was to him as a daughter. Okay, 1 and 8, which I bolded on the handout, look to be, or at least they have the superficial grammar of what Michael Thompson in his book Life in Action calls natural historical judgments. According to Thompson, the representation of life or living things in language or thought has a special logical form or grammar, something that's familiar to us from the narration that floats over natural history documentaries. So you might hear David Attenborough kind of ringing in your ear when you read some of these sentences. Such judgments typically have a life form term in the grammatical subject position. So this might occur with the definite article or in plural form, and we'll see some examples shortly. They are formulated in the present tense and describe life activities and characteristics. Where temporal relations are expressed, they designate phases or life stages. Like Thompson says, the temporal indicators express a B rather than an A series in mathematical sense. They are not quantified, which is very important, which is why I think I've got that kind of Okay, so I checked the National Trust's online entry for Cambridgeshire's Wick and Fen, which I'm sure some of you have been to, and I want to go to now, having checked out these examples. Yeah, so here are a few examples for you to reflect on, just to try and get an idea of what this form is. So VS is or has does F. Okay, so there's the in the grammatical subject you have the life form term. So here's an example. The male bittern booms during the breeding season, making a loud, low foghorn sound that carries for up to 2 miles. Here's another way in which the natural historical judgment might be expressed. S's are, have, do, F. Harvest mice build a spherical nest of tightly woven grass high up in the tall grasses. in which the female will give birth to around 6 young. S's characteristically are, have, do, F, or this is part of how S's live. They are, have, do, F. So voles live in bird system. But, of course, a sentence that has the superficial form of the natural historical judgment may not yet be one. So in natural goodness, Philippa Foot gives an example. The blue tit has a round blue patch on its head, has the same superficial grammar as the male peacock has a brightly coloured tail. Yet, as Foot observes, in the life of the blue tit, the colour of head plays no role. So here we have to distinguish between description and explanation. So Foot's thought is, properly speaking, natural historical judgments enter into teleological explanations or hypotheses that might be expressed by way of phrases like in order to or so that. Subordinate individuals in wolf packs have the capacity to express a wider range of emotions so that they can pacify and engage with more dominant pack members. But there may be commonly ascribable features that explain nothing about what is characteristic in the way of the life of an S. Some S not being that way then, so the drab-headed blue tit in Philippa Foot's garden, would not make it any less of an S. Foot wants to show that there is an internal relation between a kind of assessment that we might make of an individual thing, an individual living thing, the normative judgment that things are or are not with this individual as they should be, and the conception of the life form that natural historical judgment so understood express. The prize she is after in natural goodness is the idea that moral evaluation involves this kind of assessment. That is, it is an assessment of natural. Now, it might be suggested that the ubiquity of other animals in the lives of humans is very much like the ubiquity of blue patches on the heads of blue tits, and that one displays only the superficial grammar of a natural historical judgment and is not a natural historical judgment, strictly speaking. I'm just curious, how many people here have pets or were brought up with pets? Okay. So we are not then committing ourselves to the perhaps incredible idea that any human life lived without animals is not as it should be. Okay, but I'm doubtful that Foot would go this way. That is, that she would suppose 1 and 8 on that list display only the superficial grammar of natural historical judgment. For one, many human practices that support the distinctive life activities of humans have historically involved and involve labouring animals. Second, humans are a social species. If 8 is true, there is no necessity that each and every human has that capacity, so we can't all be horse whisperers. As it happens, Foot gives us another way to think about one. The nests of mice and burrows of voles can be said to possess a kind of secondary goodness. Natural goodness is autonomous insofar as it depends for Foot directly on the relation of an individual to the life form of its species. Secondary goodness is derivative. It is goodness that is relative to some need or interest that whatever possesses the goodness satisfies. So I'm going to give you an example of Foot, which I think is very striking. Horses that carry us as we want to be carried are good for her in this derivative sense. Okay? That Foot thinks that what we have here is a species of secondary goodness suggests that by her lights, and to use her idiom, some human good does hang on something like one. So perhaps we can further resist the idea that one does not express a natural historical judgment properly. But if so, I think we might begin to feel uneasy. For it seems it is a logical, if not yet a substantive feature of Foot's view that something of the autonomous human good may depend on a derivative good that involves other animals who may or may not be living a life that is characteristic of their kind. The philosopher attracted by ethical naturalism, I'm kind of looking around, will surely not want to make this kind of ambivalence a feature that is internal to her phase of ethical theory. So what can be said? Well, this at the very least, that the relation between humans and the animals whose lives they practically arrange is not like the relation between harvest mice and the field grass they assemble into nests. Even where there is exploitation, there is, as Midgley urges in 2, 3, 4, 6, and 7, interaction, attention, and affection. In many cases, though still imperfect, we can add to this list invocation, shared interest, and motivation. More ambitiously or boldly, there is a kind of natural good to be had that transcends the realm of the autonomous. How can we make that leap? So my suggestion is that Mitchell's notion of mixed community can take us some way. The notion of community is, of course, central to many fields of study, so I'm just going to pick two. First, ecology. In a 2020 textbook entitled Joint Species Distribution Modeling, the authors tell us that an ecological community is generally understood as the assemblage of at least two potentially interacting species at a given time and location. The extreme generality of this understanding leaves space for potential interaction. Species may or may not interact, as well as the nature and timescale of any potential interaction. What is crucial, however, is that species co-occur over some period in the same spatially delimited area. Turning to sociology, it's not surprising to find that space remains key, but now transfigured as those places or locales to which communities are related, and in the context of which community members can feel themselves to belong to certain forms of sharing, for instance, of resources, or by shared practices, interests, experiences, and identities. As such, communities as social realities are grounded in relational ties, and we've heard from Greg about this, like trust rather than by contract. Either way, community is a normative idea. The Midgleyean mixed community has the hallmarks of the concept studied by both these fields. But what I want to emphasize, at least to begin, is the historicity and the particularity that 6 and 7 on that list make visible. So I want to give you another example that Midgley gives in Animals and Why They Matter, because I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on this example. So, she quotes from a book called Emma and I, which are the memoirs of the author Sheila Hockin, who is blind. Hockin recalls learning to walk with a guide dog, and this is D on your handout. So these are Hockin's words. The dog trainer says, "Don't stop talking or Emma will think you've fallen asleep. You've got to keep her interest. She's a dog. And there are lots of nice, interesting smells all around and things passing which you can't see. So unless you talk to her, she'll get distracted and stop to sniff a lamppost." Midgley hones in on the differing sensory ecologies through which Hockin as a blind woman and Emma as a dog are moving. She writes, "This is a particularly good example because it makes so clear the point that there is no question of illicitly attributing human sensibility. The trainer, whose interest is of course purely practical, is at pains to point out just what is distinctive about the dog's own sensibilities, simply because they must be allowed for if it is to do its work." So, here the achievement of human good does indeed hang on the goodness that is derived from the dog's capacity through selective breeding to be trained by humans to lead them where they want to be led. And it is true that Emma is not living a life that is characteristic of her kind. But what Midgley draws from this example perhaps allows us to say something more philosophically interesting. So she continues, "The trainer necessarily and properly uses the same words, interest, distract, should think you've fallen asleep, which would be used in a comparable human case. The wide difference between the two species does not affect the correctness of this language at all." So I want you now to return to Thompson and reflect on the trainer's reminder to Hockin. So the trainer says, "She's a dog." Thompson's analysis of the special logical form of natural historical judgment tells us something of the kind of knowledge that is folded into the species name. It is something of the life form of the dog, including characteristic ways of filling out space and time. This is the kind of knowledge, for example, the knowledge that the dog acquires and interprets information about its environment through sniffing, that prompts the trainer's recommendation, "Don't stop talking or Emma will think you've fallen asleep. You've got to keep her interest." This is the trainer's recommendation to Hockin, who remembers a blind woman. But the trainer also assumes that it is possible that Emma's interest can be kept by being addressed by Hockin. Or cast differently, it is a possibility for Emma that her interest can be engaged and sustained by Hockin, And of course, Midgley is not speaking metaphorically when she says that the trainer properly uses the word think in imagining what Emma might suppose had happened should Hawking go silent. For having fallen asleep is one among the possibilities for humans who are not talking or who are not walking. Thomson's work encourages us to suppose that life form, this is the way I read him, life forms are partly such as to fill out space and time in a specific way. Whether space and time are ever filled out in that way, so the environment may be too degraded, the life form may be extinct. On this understanding, insofar as Emma's particular path through space and time is at least partly shaped by Hawking's practical ends, it is natural to feel that Emma's life is distorted, and by the standards of neo-Aristotelian ethical naturalism, so it is. We can put it pictorially in this way. In the Venn diagram of Hawking's life, Emma's life is a subset. Midgley's work, I think, invites us to imagine a different configuration. Both Hawking and Emma's lives are unfolding at a common place and time. They co-occur. Granted, this is not happenstance. Emma is Hawking's guide dog. At the same time, the life forms that give shape to those particular trajectories through space over time intersect. Part of what is possible in the life of the dog is something that a human can reach. But something of what is possible for humans is possible for Emma. She responds to her name. What Hawking says is such as can shape her interest. Likewise, what is possible in the life of a human is something that a dog can reach. But something of what is possible for dogs is possible for Hawking. She waits for Emma, as Emma waits for her. She greets Emma. They greet each other. It is, of course, true that the intersection is imbalanced or imperfect. Hawking's particular path through space and time has, we might assume, aspects of the dog-like pattern only in some very small respect, while much of Emma's life revolves around, for example, the fetching of shoes from under dressing tables. But though imperfect, what grounds the possibility of intersection, life form intersection, and sustains it in this case is what Midgley speaks of in 2, 3, 4, 6, and 7. So this is what marks off the present example from forms of industrial farming and other functionally similar practical arrangements of animal bodies for human ends, which we can now say are materially organized so as to exclude life form co-occurrence. They are such that any of the kinds of relational tie they belong to and are proper to community are practically and by various means extinguished. Okay, so I now want to develop the bold claim that in Midgley, there is a kind of natural good to be had that transcends the realm of the autonomous, contra both Foote and Thomson, at least as they appear on the page. This first requires an outline of Midgley's distinctive moral psychology, which I think someone was asking about, which also furnishes us with the conception of a life form which can make sense of this kind of multi-species overlap or intersection, the kind of intersection that you get in the case of Emma and Hawking. And so I want to suggest then the notion of mixed community. For Midgley, this might be controversial. So Midgley has been told to be a virtue ethicist, but I think it's more fruitful to think of her as a philosopher of motive. Motives are instinctual tendencies that for Midgley belong to us as animals. They are such tendencies as can be given with infinitesimal action descriptions: to flee, to home, to mate, to play, to explore, to dominate. We might think of them as possible vectors. They have a natural pattern. For instance, after a period of foraging or shopping, a creature might want to rest or to share or to perhaps gloat over her haul. Midgley's method in Beast and Man is to call on ethology to excavate aspects of the structure of the motivational passion for humans, and we heard this recently in Tom's talk, but I think he's gone. This is both because she sees our animality as continuous with other forms of life, in a sense I want to talk about at the end of the talk, and because as she sees it, our culture can stop us from asking the kinds of questions that would uncover passions that we might otherwise wish to suppress. And this is in fact where she thinks Freud's work has proved enormously useful, if reductive, because it's not all about sex. So here the poet and the historian join with the ethologist as archaeologists of motive. This is because in the human case, circumstances in which individuals are motivated to go after certain things may be enormously complex. So hence the length of Russian novels. Indeed, for Midgley, it's from this complexity that human morality springs. Okay, so her 1994 book, The Ethical Primate, I don't think it's on your handout, opens. Human morality is not a brute anomaly in the world. Our moral freedom is not something biologically bizarre. Human moral capacities are just what could be expected to evolve when a highly social creature becomes intelligent enough to become aware of profound conflicts among its motives. Morality is envisaged then as a system for enabling us to establish priorities in the face of conflicting motives. This is a necessity since each of us has only one life to lead, sadly. We can only track one path through space and time. Culture supplements and informs this capacity in various ways. For instance, the stopping modals, you mustn't, thou shalt not. These are meant to completely exclude certain possibilities for human action, despite, or even especially where, otherwise compelling motives are present in the circumstances. Material institutions impose their own local ordering, as do social circumstances at large, especially where material needs are not met and the possibility of acting out of even very basic motives is completely foreclosed. In fact, often it's only in literature that we can get any sense at all of what the complete working out of a possible motive would look like. We may come to see how, in the life of an individual, motivational passions can reify into what we might otherwise mistakenly take to be disposition from which token actions causally spring. And in her 1984 book, Wickedness, she discusses Shakespeare's Iago at length in an amazing discussion, which I recommend. We may come to see how passion of priorities may come to confer an organizational structure on the life of an individual, as when, to choose one of Midgley's more close to home examples, an academic pervasively acts out of ambition and not curiosity. But motives luckily come in sets. The one who acts out of ambition may also be acting out of the need for recognition or esteem, which is connected to the need for belonging, to belong, and ultimately attachment to be loved. In fact, there is scarcely any motive for Midgley that is worthy or vicious in itself on my reading, save perhaps the motivation to destroy. What matters rather is balance or proportionality, that one motive does not crowd out the others and dull our capacity to live as we are capable of living. Reason plays this balancing role and ordering role, but feeling is integral. The pair in this sense are one. This is because to possess a motive is to be able to act in a certain way given what is in the circumstances. For instance, the creature that possesses the motive to defend their territory, may, on finding an intruder in their lair, act on that motive. Here, feelings of fear or anger may be informative and make this reason, or as I would like to say, this because in the circumstances, especially salient or significant. But this territorial motive may only be one among the possible trajectories for our imagined creature. They may also possess the motive to give assistance to the weak or helpless, a motive which of course comes with its own effective halo. And if this motive is strong, and if the intruder is wounded or very young, this consideration in the circumstances may be more powerful, and the intruder may be not just spared, but rescued. For a social species, we can perhaps see the benefit should the underlying motivational structure belonging to a species vary across individuals. Suppose a second lair dweller appears. Should the two lair dwellers be able to communicate, one might influence the other. One might give the other the nod to take the lead. Should they have language, they may discuss what to do, what ought they do. Should they read and write literature, they may have come across circumstances such as this before, fictional circumstances, and perhaps have some dim or even fantastical idea about how to proceed. That the passionate motives that is natural for a creature form a structure, or as Midgley sometimes says, a knot. For some creatures, those with what she calls open instincts, this structure can be repassioned. In the human case, this may be so by various means, both in the circumstances and over time, and for better or worse. A sudden cry. Now it's surely plain that the intruder needs help and not a fight. Through training and discipline. Think before you act, weigh up the consequences. A conversation, remember what we did last time. The story, Goldilocks ate all the bowls of porridge. Some bit of rhetoric or philosophy, intruders are sub-rational, feelings are brutish. There are motivational sets can be unravelled and reknotted by such varied means and explains why the ways in which we're collectively and individually driven to act is often very difficult to fathom. The power to repattern belongs to so many external sources, but we also have it within ourselves. In a highly discussed example, including by Midgley, Iris Murdoch writes of a mother-in-law, M, who judges her son to have married beneath him. M behaves beautifully to the girl D, despite thinking her vulgar. Later, with D deceased or gone away, M reflects. Of course, D was her son's wife, reason enough to treat her beautifully. And naturally, it is proper not to behave other than beautifully to the girl herself, but that such motives took precedence over the motive that the presence of the girl herself constituted belies the operation then of a further drive, the motive to seek or preserve social status for conventional prestige. The fact that we have some kind of temporal perspective on our unfolding lives demands, as Midgley puts it, that we sometimes make a policy change or risk engaging in self-deception, something that M, as the well-intentioned person Murdoch says she is, did not persist in. But this is difficult. Midgley writes, we need to be continuous beings, harmonious through time, yet we are subject to all kinds of passing impulses and also to deeper changes of attitude. What this shows is that motives can operate discreetly, even where they come in sets. That is why the structure of most of our lives is, on a hard look, rationally inconsistent or even hypocritical. I say this as I've been thinking about like pouring the cow's milk into my coffee at this particular conference. Anyway, what this shows is that, most of the structure of our lives is either rationally consistent or hypocritical. And we can and must tolerate a bit of this, Midgley thinks, but we shouldn't tolerate too much. This is because in the end, though our motivations are often obscure to us, most of us do have a general idea of what matters in human life, and this is F on the handout. We know that there have to be some things that are naturally more important, more central to human life than others, and we have a good general idea of what sorts of things they are and how to compare them. We are not really in the helplessly ignorant situation philosophical discussions often suggest. It is odd that people are struck by total ignorance when they turn to moral philosophy. Pretending that we do not have this skill is in fact a form of hypocrisy, and this is actually really important for anyone who's taught moral theory recently, the last couple of decades. Okay, it's a feature of Midgley's meta-philosophy that the motives that underpin certain forms of philosophical display, especially in moral philosophy, are a long distance from the urge to metaphysics. So I have suggested in the particular co-occurring historical trajectories through space and time that are the lives of Emma and Hocken, there is an intersection that is framed by their interaction, by their each having some limited awareness of what is possible for the other. We can now deepen this picture. Hocken says of Emma that she took on the responsibility for her every need. That every need of Emma's was even partially satisfied by Hocken, of course, goes some way to explaining the degree to which Emma's motivational set is repatterned in the context of their overlapping lives. We are motivated to go after what we need. What Emma needs to go after is shaped by her being Hocken's guide dog. Hocken, of course, has a motive to satisfy Emma's wants. She is blind and Emma is her guide dog. But it would be wrong to suggest or to suppose that Emma's motives in caring for Emma are mostly or even partly instrumental and that they don't spring from real affection. This is 7. We must be able to acknowledge both that Emma is not living the life that is characteristic of her kind, that her life is disordered in this sense, but also the reality that there is something properly life-affirming for both of them in their life together, and that in Emma's circumstances, though they are certainly deprived, as Hocken's circumstances are, Hocken cannot see, freedom remains. Though I have introduced the idea of intersection, Midgley's own exploratory metaphor is in fact more radical, and this is H on your handout. The species barrier, imposing though it may look, is rather like one of those tall wire fences whose impressiveness is confined to their upper reaches. To an adult in formal dress engaged on his official statesmanly interactions, The fence is an insuperable barrier down below, where it is full of holes, it presents no obstacle at all. The young of Homo sapiens, like those of other species, scurry through it all the time. That the species barrier is porous in this way, I think, brings us closer towards a conception of community that has less imbalance and is more, in a chemical sense, a mixture. Mixtures, in the sense that we are after, might be said to be compositions of different substances, in this case, life forms. They are not combinations, for it is precisely in chemical combination that the elements combined lose their active powers and remain only as potentialities in the product. This perhaps suggests a way of acknowledging the kind of distortion that exists where there is imbalance, even while insisting that since there is imbalance, there is still heterogeneity. The composition, in contrast, involves heterogeneity that remains fully separable while mixed, like oil and water, and is such that active and passive powers persist. Midgley's vision of mixed community, I want to suggest, is a vision of composition, and where the composing substances belong to the infantile phase, just as water, ice, and steam are all phases of H2O. I learned this when I started reading some philosophy of chemistry. The chemistry is greatest, and I'll just let you read the passage, which is on your handout, I think. So it begins, play signal penetrates species barrier. Yeah. It's H on the handout, so the second time long approach. So perhaps we can now say that the lives of Emma and Håkon involve both combination and composition, but it is in the composition of active powers that the ideal of mixed community lies. So I now want to circle back to Foote's thought that natural goodness is autonomous. Recall that natural goodness is autonomous insofar as it depends directly on the relation of an individual to the life form of its species. Secondary goodness is derivative. It is goodness that is relative to some need or interest that whatever possesses, the goodness satisfies. So I staged a challenge for Foote that flows from her claim that the human use of animals may possess a kind of secondary goodness. And I said that without constraint, this may well be consistent with those animals not living a life that is characteristic of their kind, right? We now have such a constraint, I hope. Whatever secondary goodness may hang on the interaction of humans with other animals, the mixture that results, when a mixture results, should not be such as to necessitate the loss of the powers that belong to either or any species proper. This constraint, I think, allows for a Kantian response on behalf of Foote. We risk losing our powers of empathy, virtue, and hence for Foote, practical rationality in arrangements that involve the distortion of animal life. As it happens, accounting for mixed community is no part of Foote's elegant account. Nevertheless, it strikes me as an artifact of the logic of that account that she cannot, in the end, make space for a kind of natural goodness that goes beyond the autonomous. So let me explain why. Maybe some of you have already guessed and seen it. Foote's opponent is, as well as you may know, or some of you may know, is the moral subjectivist of various stripes. One for whom a judgment being a moral judgment rests on there being in the mind or heart of the one who's making the judgment, some attitude, feeling, some commitment or connotative state, in terms of which the evaluative content of a token moral judgment, something is good or bad, can be analysed, and in terms of which the action guiding character of moral evaluation can be explained. For Foote, this assumption is all wrong, is a mistake. That's her famous paper, which is Moral Subjectivism, Rest and a Mistake, which echoes, of course, the Ritchie paper. It's a mistake, and the idea of natural goodness is meant as a corrective. It's a corrective because with this idea, moral evaluation can, as Foote puts it, reach all the way to its grounds. That is to say, when we are assessing the dispositions and conduct of some individual human being, we evaluate them relative to the life form. This being the case, our evaluation does not depend on the presence, here and now, of some current feeling, attitude, state, or commitment present in the one who is on the scene doing the evaluating. Note these terms: here, now, on the scene, occurrent. Good can evade these, and so the threat of moral subjectivism. Okay, she can evade them because she's appealing to the life form, right? But this evasion may come at a cost. Good strategy can come to seem like an attempt to escape the present. Now, one of Midgley's 18 books is called Why Make Moral Judgments. Her concern is, in fact, less with moral evaluation than valuing. Creatures value and satisfy their needs, and we heard this from Enrico's wonderful talk yesterday. And they are motivated to go after what is valued. As we've seen from Midgley, many goods are common to different life forms, which may also share common motivational patterns. But as we've also seen, some of these goods, especially when they are composed in mixed community, may be such as can only be expressed and satisfied in the present, as when, here and now, the human baby makes a beeline for the kitten and the kitten reciprocates. Earlier, I drew inspiration from Thompson's conception of a life form, and I really have drawn inspiration from this, his view, to create an opening for such kinds of life form intersection or overlap. Yet for all the fecundity of Thompson's treatment, it strikes me that it too can only take the Midgleyean metaposition so far. Thompson's analysis of natural historical judgments is avowedly Freudian. He is concerned with the logical forms in which life is represented. His innovationists consist of existentially quantified, object-bound forms of predication are not apt for a representation of organic life. We see this in the fact that space and time, adverbial phrases of place and phase, are emphatically part of the life form descriptions that natural historical judgments express. For example, the male bittern booms during the breeding season. We are not then to conceive of organisms as bundles of causally interconnected properties that exist at places and move through space and time. This is kind of deep point. It takes a bit of thinking through, and I've got more work to do on this. But though Thompson notes this Freudian innovation, his epistemology of perception remains moored to a conception of experience wherein what can be seen is a matter of what is present in the perception array, which features and properties. But it's not a matter of who is doing the perceiving. So we can detect something of this kind of assumption in Thompson in his reading of a paper by Elizabeth Anscombe, which appears in her 1981 collection, Ethics, Religion and Politics. Anscombe's concern is with what distinguishes what she elsewhere calls contraceptive intercourse from sexual acts that are generative, insofar as they do not involve contraception. So this is Jay on your handout. This is Anscombe. Anscombe writes, I don't have to put the full reference, which I should. Its paper is Can You Have Sex Without Children? And she writes, when we call something an acorn, we look to a wider context than can be seen in the acorn itself. Oaks come from acorns come from oaks. An acorn is as such generative of a note, whether or not it does generate a note. The notion of the wider context is what strikes Thompson's creative philosophical interest. He writes, in thinking of something as an acorn, we tie it up specifically with oaks, none of which need be present here. And so, of course, we look beyond the individual lump of stuff. We imagine the genesis of a novel kind of shark. It can sometimes be observed to chase after small fish and incorporate them, but where no part of this flesh ever enters the bloodstream. Instead, it makes a hideous brood which it occasionally spews out to frighten the predator. What looks like eating is not eating, just as by Anscombe's lights, what looks like sex in the case of contraceptive intercourse is not sex, since it is not generative, not a generative act. Thompson comments, when we call something eating then, we appeal to something more than is available in the mere spectacle of the thing here and now. Philosophers can arrange, in Philippa Foot's phrase, that the spectacle should be there with or without the phenomenon of eating. I want to say there's something really important here in the idiom of the spectacular, where to go beyond the merely spectacular, beyond what can be presented to the spectator, is called to involve an appeal to more than is available here and now. Again, Midgley's epistemology is different. Midgley would agree with Thompson that calling something an acorn involves relating it to a wider context, to non-present oak trees. She thinks that we sometimes need the apologist to tell us what is going on here and now with some individual thing or some trace of that thing, its burrows or its spherical nests. And this is especially so with species who are remote from it. But she does not think that this is because of the general skeptical difficulty that we face whenever we are presented with the spectacle of some living thing here and now, such that we need to go beyond what is present here and now. Rather, in many cases for Midgley, we should not be surprised to find the understanding in ourselves. This is not only because we are in possession of the form of representation that is the representation of life, but because, to recall the first line of Beast and Man, we are not rather like animals, we are animals. And what's really more, we are on the scene. Because we are animals, we are typically not completely alienated from what we see before us when we encounter some other living thing. The form of understanding that we have is in our being, in the loosely patterned motivational knot that structures our complex ways of going on, a knot which can be loosened and repatterned. Okay, I'm really getting to the end now. I hope you're hanging on in there. Okay, so I want to close by saying a little more about how this loosely patterned motivational knot and say more about this loosely patterned motivational knot and its significance for the Midgleyean metaphysician. And I want to do so by recalling somehow now in synchrony, I hope, the images with which I began. So there's a way of thinking of likeness as resemblance, where a high level of resemblance may reasonably justify inferring identity. Midgley no doubt has this notion of resemblance in mind when she says we are not rather just like animals. But as we've seen, two things or events can look to have the same properties. They may look to have the same properties, but they may not yet be the same. I have said that Midgley's strategy of argumentation in Beast and Man is, like Foote and Thompson's, to also look to the wider context. But instead of looking to a species' relative wider context to disable the threat of moral subjectivism, or to unsettle a property-based conception of organic life that may be apt to generate skepticism, Midgley instead looks for different kinds of likenesses between us and other animals, analogical likenesses, and this brings us to Sophia and Eddie's work now. Homology is likeness due to kinship. Birds are akin and their wings are homologous. But analogical similarities are functional similarities which are not based on kinship. Recalling Darwin's note to self, analogical likenesses need not discriminate between higher or lower life forms, and as Midgley writes, they may even yield the organic to the inorganic. If we are studying the penguin's flippers, she says, we should look at the flippers of seals and whales, the fins of fish, and quite possibly the propellers of submarines. Here the emphasis is on the parts of animals and their function in some medium, sea or air. What Beast and Man explores, however, is less the parts of animals and their function than what might be called behavioral or motivational analogies. For instance, pair bonding is a behavior in which humans are analogically related, not only to wolves, lemurs, and gibbons, but to birds, mice, and most specifically in Midgley's tally, the painted shrimp. In our capacity to form and sustain social bonds, to forge friendships, we are analogically related to jackdaws, wild dogs, and dolphins, all of which display these social motivational patterns. And I think Catherine's wonderful talk has encouraged us to see through Socrates' eyes ourselves as analogically related to pigs and gully birds. These analogies exist in nature, and what the ecologist excavates, the moral philosopher can learn from. In acknowledging that we are not just rather like animals, we are animals, the question then becomes, which animals are we like? And here, as Midgley insists, homology does not win out over analogy. So if you look at K on your handout, she says, primates do not have big cooperative enterprises, nor therefore the loyalty, fidelity, and developed skills that go with them, nor do they have fixed homes and families, but the hunting carnivores do. And neither apes nor wolves have anything like the human length of life, nor therefore the same chance of accumulating wisdom and deepening relationships that elephants do. And no mammal really shares the strong visual interest that is so important both to our social life and to our art, nor perhaps need to work as hard as we do to rear our young, but birds do. Human life is analogous in many of its aspects then to the lives of other animals. To discover an analogical relation between us and some other living creature is to encounter an aspect of ourselves realized in some other life form. So understood, the human life form can be seen as at least partially unified in a manifold of other life forms that are not human, those of the horse, wolf, elephant, lemur, and shrimp. And we in turn may come to view ourselves as part of a manifold in which other forms of life are unified analogically through us. But though the discovery of such analogical relations is the work of the ethologist, because we ourselves are in animals, such analogies are also apt to be felt and known, as when a likeness is discovered in an encounter here and now. This finally is what I meant when I said that Jane Goodall was encountering part of the whole of life from within, and why in this sense Goodall is like the metaphysician, a wanderer or an explorer. The movement of discovery is at once outward and inward. The wider context is within. Midgleyean asks in her default thesis, are there no foxes in the human soul? Iris Murdoch writes that metaphysics sets up a picture which it then offers as an appeal to us all to see if we cannot find just this in our deepest experience. That is to say, metaphysics gives us a framework in which we can try to seek out some parts of ourselves, those that it makes intelligible and that it relates. I have tried to suggest that for the Midgleyean metaphysician, the grounds of analogical unity in the motivational sphere may also be the possible ground of composition in mixed communities, and that such composition may itself be a real source of natural goodness, one that transcends species bounds. But this, of course, is just the first step on the journey towards a certain kind of whole. It's a planetary whole, which in Midgleye's place philosophy symbolized by Gaia. But the real metaphysical test, I think, of the picture of mixed community lies, as Murdoch says, in the appeal it issues to us all, the powers it may help us find, and what by grace we might become. Thank you.